Hello there. So this is the first video I'm going to be doing. Instead of jumping straight into getting out a text editor and perhaps doing a bit of coding, what I first wanted to do was to just explain a little bit about PHP before we start physically doing stuff. So hopefully by the end of this we should be able to understand how PHP works, so we have a good understanding when we come to start actually programming. So, how does PHP work? Firstly, PHP is a pre-processing engine, or a preprocessor. What this means is that PHP actually processes the information that you ask it to before the client even sees the document. Unlike JavaScript, where the document is loaded and then JavaScript makes changes to the document after the client's already received it. I'll go into a little bit more about that in a minute. Chronological. PHP is chronological. It can't, once you've written the code and it's operated or passed that bit of code through the engine, it can't go back. It only works from top to bottom, and it only does one pass. There's no going back to reference another piece of information or anything like that. There are ways around it, which you'll learn a bit more about in future. Again, there's a little bit more about that in just a moment. The other thing is that PHP is free, which is advantages, and there's also some negatives there as well. I mean, the beauty of it being free is obviously it saves us a lot of money. It also means that the knowledge is out there, very widespread. Because it's free, and because it's popular, there's a lot of people out there that know what they're doing. There's a lot of people that can give you help, and there's a lot of resources to learn from. So that's the good thing. The only negative of PHP is that because it is free, and it is so popular, it leaves it makes the knowledge of the system that much more wider. And the more people that know about it, the more people know how to hack your system, essentially. So it means that you can't be lazy. You've got to stay on top of things. As soon as you deploy a program, you've got to know that it's safe and it's secure, and there's no way around it. Because trust me, no matter how little you think your website is, there will always be someone that will try and get their hands hold of information, usually off of databases, or just try and cause a pain in the rear end, to be honest. A lot of them will just try and destroy your website for no apparent reason. Or they can't so much really damage documents, for instance like PHP files, but they can destroy databases and retrieve information from databases as well, which isn't too good. So 81.6% of websites use PHP. So that is quite a lot when you think about it. It's something like 17% of websites use ASP.NET, which is PHP's closest rival, which is the Microsoft version of it. Now, the only thing with ASP.NET, to run it properly, you need a Windows server. To run a Windows server, you need a Windows operating system. As you can imagine, that costs a fair old whack. So, I mean, there's usually two types of servers. You have the Windows versions, or you have the Unix versions, which is Ubuntu, Red Hat, CentOS, that kind of thing. The Unix systems, or the Linux systems, or Linux if you're American, are free. They're open source, which also means you can develop them as well. So that allows you to have PHP on a free server. You can also install it on Windows as well, that's not a problem. But it means that ASP.NET only really properly can be installed on a Windows server, which is a lot of money when you're paying for Windows licenses for a server. So that has a massive effect on the amount of users, unfortunately. I mean, ASP.NET is a very good language, not one I've looked too much into myself. I mean, PHP does everything I'd need it to do, and there's not much I can't do with PHP. It's a very versatile language, and 81.6% of people, feel the same. So, its object-oriented programming capabilities. Now, again, this is something that you're not really going to come into until perhaps we move on to the more intermediate stuff. But it basically allows you to basically create a family of functions and controls, methods, to basically make the long life of your website, the continual development, a lot easier. It's kind of one of those things that's the lesser of two evils. You either continually rewrite code across different pages, reusing a lot of code from previous pages or documents, or you spend a bit of time before you actually get started and write out some decent libraries, and it saves you a lot of time in the future. It also makes it a little bit easier to use. Once you get going, they're not so easy to write. Once you've got them up and going, they can save you so much time and make things so much easier to do. The next thing is strong database communication. Built into PHP, they've added MySQL support, which is a type of database, or MySQL. They also have MS SQL, which is the Microsoft version. I do believe there's that might be the only ones as default. But I mean, with PHP, there's a lot of add-ons and libraries that you can add to it to make it more powerful, essentially. Right. What is a preprocessor? Now, this is quite important. In order to understand how PHP works and what you can do with PHP, you have to understand how the client receives the information you're giving it. First thing to note is that it all starts from the user accessing your website, types in your website address, and their computer will communicate with your server. If it's accessing a PHP document, it's then going to go to PHP, the PHP engine itself. The PHP engine will parse any PHP code that's within the document, make any changes, access a database perhaps, make database changes, whatever it is that's in that document, or any other document that document references, it will parse as well, if included. It will decide what it's going to output to the HTML, and then it will pass that information onto the HTML document. So it's essentially just the same as you writing your own website in HTML. It produces the same result, but what it allows you to do is adapt what document the client will see, because once this HTML document's been adapted, it then gets sent off to the client computer. Client computer will pass it on to the browser. Now, this is the important bit. This is where the JavaScript comes in. We're not going to go into JavaScript. It's just to kind of compare and contrast between the two. Once the document's got to the browser will the browser actually controls the JavaScript. A lot of people seem to think JavaScript. I think they get it confused with Java. Java and JavaScript, two very different languages, two completely different languages. JavaScript is built into most modern browsers. However, not all browsers. There are some very lightweight browsers out there, and very old browsers out there that don't actually support JavaScript. I think the likelihood of you using one of those browsers is very, very slim. But nonetheless, JavaScript is part of the browser. So any JavaScript code within that HTML document will then be taken by the browser's JavaScript module, and it will treat it as it likes, so to speak. It can slightly differ from browser to browser, which is quite annoying. And then finally, once JavaScript has had its look over the files, I mean, a lot of it might be time delayed. It might come up in 10 seconds time, could perhaps be an effect, but essentially JavaScript will have a look over it. It will decide what it needs to do at what time, and then it gets passed to the user's eye. you see the end effect. But it's important to understand that the client goes to the server. The next thing the server does is ask PHP to parse the document. Okay, so there is no interaction between the user, the browser, or the user's computer. Nothing communicates with PHP. Okay, the only thing that communicates with PHP is your server. Your server and PHP are two different things. Your server is Apache. It's a web server. Your web server will then communicate with PHP, ask it to pass any information in the .php document or any other file extension that is linked to PHP, and PHP will basically return what it's done, essentially, and then that gets passed then back to the client. Okay, so there's no communication between the two. It's a preprocessor before JavaScript or styling or anything like that, or the browser sees it. PHP has already done its job. There's no changing once the page is loaded, nothing like that. PHP processes the information before the client receives it. So once it's done, it's done. Okay, like I said earlier, it moves from top to bottom. Once it's done, it's done. That's it. There are ways of bridging the gap between the browser using JavaScript and Ajax and PHP. But again, that goes to the browser, to the server, to PHP, back to the browser. Okay, so moving on. Chronology. PHP only works from top to bottom of the document. Never under any circumstances, it would be good if there's a Y in there, will PHP return for a second pass. Okay, so it will literally work its way down the document, top to bottom, left to right, and once it's done that, it's done. It closes the document, tells your server it's done, passes the HTML file back to your server, which then passes it back onto the client server. It won't come back round again. The other thing to note is that PHP deposits statements wherever the code snippet is placed. For instance, you'll come to learn about this. An echo statement will print whatever you're asking it to. For instance, a statement like "My name is Josh." It will print that to the document. Okay. But what you need to remember is that PHP only prints where the snippet is. You can't ask it to print anywhere else. For instance, you can't reference an element like you could in JavaScript. For instance, select a header and change the heading in that. The snippet with itself would actually have to be inside the header tag, the H1 tag or the H2 tag. You can't access anything else in the HTML document. You literally deposit information wherever the code is sat. Can't access anything else. Okay. So where do we start? The basics is where we're going to start. The first thing we need to have a look into is variables. Variables are very important. They are essentially the memory bank of the engine, really. If you think of PHP as a great big engine, big V8 engine, it only has so much space in its brain. Okay, if you ask it to remember something, you've got to give it an easy reference. Okay, so for instance, if I was to ask you to remember the numbers 6 and 4, okay, you're going to remember 6 and 4. If I asked you to take 1 away from 6, you'd end up with 5 and 4. Okay. If I asked you to take the second one away from the first one, you'd end up with 1. Okay. PHP works in the same way. The same as I asked you to put those numbers in your head and work them out in your head, PHP does exactly the same thing. Okay. The variables are a way in which we can access what's in PHP's head, and only information, and predominantly information we put in PHP's head. However, there are some global variables that we can't touch. We'll go into that some more. Operators. Now this is things like greater than signs, smaller than signs, equal signs, plus, times, take away, divide, all the different operators really, and, or, all those kind of things. We'll look a little bit into that. Then we'll move on to functions and how functions can help your program, how they benefit you, and with that knowledge we will hopefully create our first program. So I'm eager to get started. So as soon as you're ready, pop on to the next video and we'll get going.